Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The autumn air bit through my jacket as our school bus rumbled up the gravel road towards Cedar Ridge Environmental Camp in October 2018. I was 11 years old, starting my 6th grade year, and this 3-day educational trip was supposed to teach us about environmental conservation and outdoor survival skills. The excitement that had filled our classroom weeks earlier had now transformed into nervous energy as we caught our first glimpse of the facility through the dusty bus windows. Cedar Ridge Camp looked nothing like the glossy brochures our teacher had shown us. The main lodge sat hunched against the tree line, its wood siding weathered gray and black with age and moisture. Paint peeled from the window frames like diseased skin, and several shutters hung at odd angles, giving the building a lopsided, unsettling appearance. Behind the lodge, scattered throughout a clearing dotted with dying grass and muddy patches, stood our accommodations for the next 3 nights. The inequality became immediately apparent as we disembarked. The boys' cabins stood proudly on the eastern side of the camp, solid log structures with proper foundations, intact windows, and what appeared to be functional doors. Wisps of steam rose from vents on their roofs, suggesting working heating systems. The girls, however, were directed toward the western edge of the clearing, where a collection of structures that could generously be called rustic shelters awaited us. These weren't cabins in any traditional sense. They were essentially wooden frames wrapped in rough-hewn planks, with gaps between the boards wide enough to slip fingers through. The roofs consisted of corrugated metal sheets that had been patched multiple times with different materials, creating a patchwork of rust and mismatched colors. What should have been doors were simply openings covered by torn fly screens that fluttered in the wind like tattered flags of surrender. Camp Director Brennan, a heavy-set man with calloused hands and eyes that never quite met yours directly, gathered us around the flagpole for orientation. His voice carried an odd cadence, as if he were reading from a script he'd memorized long ago but no longer believed in. "Girls will be housed in the heritage accommodations," he announced with what might have been intended as enthusiasm. "These structures represent authentic frontier living conditions and will provide you with a genuine wilderness experience." The translation was clear. We were getting the worst housing because someone had decided that 11-year-old girls needed to be toughened up. The boys shuffled their feet and avoided eye contact, sensing the unfairness but saying nothing. Some of the girls began to whisper complaints, but Mrs. Henderson, our 6th grade teacher, quickly shushed them with sharp looks and warnings about maintaining positive attitudes. As we dragged our sleeping bags and duffel bags toward our assigned shelter, the reality of our situation became even more stark. The wooden platforms that served as floors were uneven and splintered, with several boards loose enough to rock underfoot. The smell hit us immediately, a mixture of mildew, rotting wood, and something else underneath that I couldn't identify but that made my stomach turn slightly. Stains darkened various sections of the walls and ceiling, their origins unknown but their appearance ominous. Our shelter housed 12 girls from our class, divided between 2 rooms separated by a thin partition that didn't reach the ceiling. The lack of proper insulation meant that every sound echoed through both spaces, creating an environment where privacy was impossible and sleep would be a challenge even under the best circumstances. The floor plan was simple and brutal in its efficiency. Wooden platforms ran along the walls where we were expected to lay out our sleeping gear. There were no beds, no mattresses, and certainly no pillows provided. The camp staff had given us thin foam mats that compressed to almost nothing under body weight, offering about as much comfort as sleeping directly on the wooden boards themselves. Chloe Martinez was my best friend and had been assigned to the same room as me, along with 4 other girls from our class. Chloe was the type of person who could find something positive in almost any situation, but even her usual optimism faltered as we surveyed our accommodations. Her long brown hair kept getting caught on the splintered walls as she moved around the cramped space, and she had already discovered that the floor sloped noticeably toward one corner where water damage had caused the supports to sag. The other girls in our room were Victoria Chen, a quiet Asian girl who wore thick glasses and always carried a water bottle covered in science-themed stickers. Twins Madison and Morgan Sullivan, who insisted on keeping their sleeping bags side by side, and Amber Johnson, a tall girl with freckles who had already started complaining loudly about everything from the smell to the lack of electrical outlets for her hairdryer. Victoria had claimed the corner spot farthest from the doorway, methodically arranging her belongings with the precision of someone who needed order to feel secure. She folded her clothes into perfect squares, lined up her toiletries in size order, and positioned her sleeping bag so that it aligned exactly with the wall boards. There was something almost obsessive about her organization, as if creating perfect order in her small space could somehow protect her from the chaos of our surroundings. The twins, Madison and Morgan, had inherited their mother's nervous energy and their father's tendency to fill silence with chatter. They moved around the room like mirror images of each other, unpacking identical belongings and commenting on every detail in overlapping sentences that created a constant stream of background noise. Their presence was both comforting and annoying. Comforting because they filled the space with familiar sounds, annoying because those sounds made it impossible to think clearly about our situation. Amber had positioned herself near the doorway, claiming she needed quick access to the bathroom during the night. She was the type of girl who had never experienced discomfort in her life, coming from a family where camping meant staying in cabins with running water and room service. Her complaints started immediately and continued in a steady stream that grated on everyone's nerves but that nobody had the energy to address directly. As darkness approached, the true nature of our accommodations became even more apparent. The torn fly screens that served as our doors offered no security and no protection from insects. Mosquitoes had already discovered our shelter and were beginning to gather in anticipatory clouds near the openings. The gaps between the wallboards allowed cold air to flow freely through the structure, and we could feel the temperature dropping as the sun disappeared behind the tree line. The inadequacy of our bedding became obvious as we attempted to create comfortable sleeping arrangements. The thin mats provided virtually no cushioning against the hard wooden platform, and our sleeping bags, designed for mild weather camping, offered little protection against the cold that seeped up through the floor. The realization that we would spend 3 nights in these conditions created a growing sense of dread that none of us wanted to acknowledge openly. By the afternoon of our first day, it became clear that the heritage accommodations were not just uncomfortable, they were actively undermining our health. The combination of cold temperatures, poor ventilation, and damp conditions had created a perfect breeding ground for respiratory infections. What started as a few sniffles during lunch had evolved into a full-blown epidemic by dinner time. The symptoms appeared almost simultaneously across both girls' shelters. First came the runny noses and scratchy throats, followed quickly by body aches and fever. Girls who had been energetic and excited during the morning orientation were now moving slowly, wrapped in jackets and sweaters, their faces flushed with fever and their voices reduced to hoarse whispers. Victoria was among the first to show serious symptoms. Her normally precise movements became sluggish and uncoordinated, and she had developed a cough that sounded disturbingly wet and deep. She continued to maintain her obsessive organization, but now it seemed to require enormous effort. I watched her rearrange her toiletries 3 times, each attempt taking longer than the last, as if her brain was struggling to process the familiar task. The twins, Madison and Morgan, had developed matching fevers that left them lying on their sleeping bags like deflated balloons. Their constant chatter had been reduced to occasional whispered exchanges between them, conversations in a language only they understood. Their mother had packed them identical care packages with medicine and throat lozenges, but the supplies were quickly depleted as other girls begged to share. Amber's complaints had taken on a desperate edge as her symptoms worsened throughout the day. She had called her parents twice on her cell phone, demanding that they come pick her up immediately. When that failed, she had marched to the camp office and demanded to speak with Director Brennan, insisting that the accommodations were uninhabitable and possibly illegal. Her protests fell on deaf ears, but her increasingly erratic behavior was beginning to worry even those of us who found her annoying. Chloe and I had somehow managed to avoid the worst of the outbreak, though we could feel the early symptoms beginning to take hold. My throat was scratchy, and I had developed a headache that seemed to intensify whenever I moved too quickly. Chloe was fighting off a persistent cough that she tried to muffle in her sleeve to avoid disturbing the sick girls around us. We took it upon ourselves to play makeshift nurses for our roommates. a role that felt simultaneously important and terrifying. Neither of us had any real medical training beyond basic first aid, but we found ourselves taking temperatures with the digital thermometer Chloe's mother had packed, dispensing over-the-counter medications, and trying to keep track of who had taken what and when. The responsibility was overwhelming. Victoria's fever had spiked to over 101 degrees, and her cough was producing a disturbing amount of phlegm that she spat into tissues with increasing frequency. The twins were shivering despite being wrapped in multiple layers, and their matching fevers seemed to be feeding off each other in some strange sympathetic response. Amber had stopped complaining and had instead become unnaturally quiet, staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes that reflected the dim light in an unsettling way. The camp staff's response to the health crisis was minimal and inadequate. When we reported the situation to the counselors, they assured us that minor illnesses were normal during outdoor experiences, and that fresh air and physical activity would help everyone recover quickly. They provided additional blankets and suggested that the girls drink more water, but they showed no inclination to move anyone to better accommodations or to contact parents about the severity of the situation. As night approached, our shelter had transformed into something resembling a field hospital. Sick girls lay on their thin mats, wrapped in insufficient bedding, coughing and shivering in the cold air that continued to pour through the gaps in the walls. The sounds of illness, coughing, sniffling, moaning, and the rustle of tissues created a symphony of misery that made the space feel even more oppressive and claustrophobic. The second night brought new challenges that pushed our already strained situation beyond tolerable limits. The sick girls had finally managed to fall into fitful sleep around 10 o'clock, their coughs and moans creating a disturbing soundtrack that echoed through our thin-walled shelter. Chloe and I remained awake, partly because we were worried about our roommates and partly because the sounds and smells of illness made rest impossible. We had positioned ourselves as close to the doorway as possible, hoping to catch some fresh air through the torn fly screen. The smell inside had become increasingly unpleasant as the day progressed, a mixture of medicine, fever sweat, and the underlying mustiness of the old building. The cold air that flowed through the gaps in the walls was uncomfortable, but it was preferable to the stagnant, sickly atmosphere that hung over the sleeping areas. Victoria had been restless all evening, tossing and turning on her mat despite her fever-induced exhaustion. Her organizational obsessions had intensified with her illness, and she had spent nearly an hour before bedtime rearranging her belongings in increasingly complex patterns. Her water bottle, covered with its science-themed stickers, had become a particular focus of her attention. She positioned and repositioned it multiple times, measuring distances with her fingers and adjusting angles with mathematical precision. The disaster struck around 11:30, just as Chloe and I were beginning to think we might be able to get some sleep ourselves. Victoria, in the midst of one of her feverish movements, knocked over her water bottle with her elbow. The bottle, which she had apparently filled to capacity despite her illness, tipped and emptied its entire contents across the wooden platform. The water spread quickly across the uneven floor, flowing downhill toward the corner where my sleeping bag was positioned. I watched in horror as the cold liquid soaked through the fabric, saturating not just the exterior, but seeping all the way through to the thin mat underneath. Within seconds, my entire sleeping arrangement was drenched in cold water that showed no signs of drying in the humid, unheated air of our shelter. The accident sent Victoria into a state of panic that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. She began apologizing repeatedly, her voice rising to a near hysteria that threatened to wake the other sick girls. Her obsessive tendencies kicked into overdrive as she tried to clean up the spill with tissues and clothing, but her feverish state made her movements clumsy and ineffective. She kept wiping the same spots over and over, muttering numbers under her breath as if she were trying to calculate the exact amount of water that had been spilled. I tried to reassure her that accidents happen and that the situation wasn't her fault, but my words seemed to make her agitation worse. She began rocking back and forth on her mat, clutching her empty water bottle against her chest like a security blanket. The fever had clearly affected her ability to process stress, and what should have been a minor inconvenience had become a major crisis in her compromised mental state. Chloe helped me wring out what water we could from my sleeping bag, but the damage was extensive. The fabric remained cold and damp. creating a sleeping surface that would be both uncomfortable and potentially dangerous in the already frigid conditions of our shelter. We hung the bag over one of the wooden beams, hoping it might dry somewhat before morning, but the humid air and lack of heating made this unlikely. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. I had managed to avoid the worst of the illness epidemic that had struck down most of my roommates, only to find myself facing a night without adequate bedding in a building that offered no protection from the cold. The temperatures outside were dropping into the 40s, and the gaps in our walls meant that the interior temperature would likely match the exterior by morning. As I contemplated the prospect of spending the night shivering on a thin mat with no insulation, a disturbing thought occurred to me. Victoria's sleeping bag looked warm and dry, and Victoria herself appeared to be finally settling into sleep. The fever that had made her so agitated seemed to be providing her with enough internal heat that she had pushed her sleeping bag partially away from her body. It would be wrong to take advantage of a sick person's belongings, but my need for warmth was becoming desperate. The temperature continued to drop as midnight approached, and the sounds of illness that had filled our shelter throughout the evening began to subside into a restless quiet. The sick girls had finally exhausted themselves into sleep, though their rest was far from peaceful. Occasional coughs and moans punctuated the silence, creating an atmosphere of unease that made relaxation impossible even for those of us who remained relatively healthy. Chloe had developed a persistent cough that she tried to muffle in her sleeve, and I could hear the congestion building in her voice when she whispered to me across the narrow space between our mats. We both knew that she was beginning to succumb to whatever illness had struck down our roommates, but neither of us wanted to acknowledge it directly. The thought of both of us becoming sick while trapped in these inadequate accommodations was too frightening to contemplate. The twins, Madison and Morgan, had finally stopped their restless tossing and had settled into a synchronized sleep pattern that was both touching and unnerving. They faced each other on their adjacent mats, their breathing falling into the same rhythm, their movements mirroring each other even in unconsciousness. Their matching fevers had given their faces an identical flush that made them look like dolls rather than real children. Amber had become increasingly quiet as her illness progressed, and her silence was somehow more disturbing than her previous complaints had been. She lay motionless on her mat, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes that reflected the dim light filtering through the torn screens. When I whispered her name to check on her condition, she turned her head toward me with mechanical precision, but didn't respond verbally. Her fever had clearly reached a level that was affecting her cognitive function. Victoria remained the sickest of our group, but her fever seemed to have stabilized somewhat after the water bottle incident. She had arranged herself in her sleeping bag with the same obsessive precision that characterized all her actions, positioning her body in perfect alignment with the wallboards and placing her belongings within exact reaching distances. Her breathing had taken on a wet, rattling quality that suggested her cold had developed into something more serious. The cold was becoming unbearable for me without proper bedding. My damp sleeping bag hung uselessly from the wooden beam where Chloe and I had positioned it, showing no signs of drying in the humid air. The thin mat provided no insulation against the wooden platform, and I could feel the cold seeping up through my clothing and into my bones. My muscles had begun to cramp from shivering, and my teeth chattered despite my efforts to control them. Chloe noticed my deteriorating condition and whispered suggestions for staying warm. We tried sharing her sleeping bag, but it was designed for one person and provided inadequate coverage for both of us. We experimented with using our jackets and extra clothing as blankets, but the cold air flowing through the wall gaps made any improvised bedding system ineffective. The thought of Victoria's warm, dry sleeping bag became increasingly tempting as my condition worsened. She appeared to be generating enough body heat from her fever that she had partially unzipped her bag and kicked off some of her covers. The contrast between her apparent warmth and my increasing cold created a situation that tested my moral boundaries. Taking advantage of a sick person's belongings was wrong, but hypothermia was a real possibility if I couldn't find adequate warmth. As I wrestled with this ethical dilemma, I began to focus more intently on Victoria's movements and sounds. Her breathing had settled into a regular pattern that suggested deep sleep, and her obsessive fidgeting had finally ceased. She appeared to be genuinely unconscious, lost in whatever feverish dreams had taken hold of her compromised mind. The decision to appropriate her sleeping bag, even temporarily, felt like crossing a moral line that would define my character for years to come. But the alternative, spending the remaining hours until dawn shivering on a thin mat in a building that offered no protection from the elements, seemed equally unacceptable. My physical need for warmth was beginning to override my ethical concerns about taking advantage of Victoria's condition. Around 1:30 in the morning, as I lay shivering on my inadequate mat and contemplating the ethics of sleeping bag theft, a movement from Victoria's corner caught my attention. Through the dim light that filtered through our torn screens, I saw her sit up slowly and methodically begin to gather specific items from her precisely arranged belongings. Her movements were deliberate and purposeful, lacking the feverish agitation that had characterized her behavior earlier in the evening. She picked up her thick-rimmed glasses and positioned them carefully on her face, adjusting them twice to ensure perfect alignment. Her water bottle, the same one that had caused my soggy sleeping bag disaster, was retrieved from its designated spot and examined briefly before being tucked under her arm. I watched with growing curiosity as Victoria stood up with surprising steadiness for someone who had been running a high fever just hours earlier. She moved with the mechanical precision that I had come to associate with her obsessive tendencies, but there was something different about her demeanor. Gone was the nervous energy and constant fidgeting that usually characterized her actions. Instead, she moved with a calm determination that seemed inconsistent with her illness. She stepped carefully over the sleeping forms of the twins, Madison and Morgan, avoiding the specific spots where their belongings were arranged. Her path to the doorway followed a precise line that suggested she had planned this route in advance, taking into account the positions of everyone in the room and the placement of all obstacles. There was something almost robotic about her navigation through the cramped space. At the doorway, Victoria paused and turned to look back into the room. The gesture seemed routine, as if she were checking to ensure she hadn't forgotten anything important. Her gaze swept across the sleeping forms of our roommates before settling briefly on me. I forced my breathing to remain steady and kept my eyes nearly closed, not wanting her to know I was awake and observing her movements. Satisfied with her inspection, Victoria pushed through the torn fly screen and disappeared into the night. Through the doorway, I could see her figure moving across the muddy clearing toward the bathroom facilities that sat approximately 3 minutes' walk from our shelter. The moon provided enough light to track her progress as she walked with the same measured, purposeful gait that had characterized her indoor movements. Chloe, who had been lying quietly on her mat beside me, shifted slightly and whispered my name. I turned to see that she was also awake and had been watching Victoria's departure with the same curiosity that had captured my attention. Her cough had worsened over the past hour, and I could hear the congestion in her voice when she spoke. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of our sleeping roommates. She moved like she wasn't even sick anymore. "And did you notice how she picked up specific things, like she had a plan?" I nodded, struck by the same observations. Victoria's behavior had seemed inconsistent with someone suffering from a high fever and respiratory infection. Her movements had been too coordinated, too purposeful, too devoid of the confusion and disorientation that had marked her actions throughout the day. Something about her midnight bathroom trip felt deliberate in a way that routine biological needs typically don't. We lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of our sick roommates, and waiting for Victoria's return. The bathroom facilities were visible from our doorway, and we would be able to see her emerge and begin her walk back to the shelter. The entire round trip should take no more than 10 minutes, allowing for the slow, careful movement that someone with her symptoms would require. But as the minutes ticked by, Victoria failed to reappear. Chloe and I began to grow concerned about her welfare, imagining scenarios where her fever had caused her to become disoriented, or where she had collapsed somewhere between the bathroom and our shelter. The thought of a sick 11-year-old girl wandering around in the cold darkness created a growing sense of anxiety that made our own discomfort seem trivial. After approximately 15 minutes had passed without Victoria's return, Chloe's concern overrode her own illness-induced lethargy. She struggled to her feet, wrapping her jacket tightly around her shoulders and preparing to venture out into the cold night air to check on our missing roommate. The prospect of leaving our inadequate but familiar shelter was daunting, but the possibility that Victoria needed help made inaction seem irresponsible. "I'll go check the bathrooms," Chloe whispered, her voice hoarse from her developing cold. Maybe she got sick in there and needs help. Or maybe she's too weak to walk back on her own. You stay here and keep an eye on everyone else in case something happens. I agreed to remain in the shelter, partly because someone needed to monitor our other sick roommates, and partly because I was reluctant to leave what little warmth I had managed to preserve under my makeshift bedding arrangement. The thought of Victoria collapsed or disoriented in the bathroom facilities created images in my mind that were difficult to dismiss, but my own physical condition was deteriorating rapidly in the cold. Chloe pushed through the torn fly screen and disappeared into the darkness, following the same path that Victoria had taken 20 minutes earlier. I watched through the doorway as her figure moved slowly across the clearing, her gait unsteady due to her illness, but her determination clear in her purposeful movement toward the distant bathroom building. While waiting for Chloe's return, I took the opportunity to address my sleeping situation. The cold had become unbearable, and my shivering was now violent enough to make my muscles ache. Victoria's absence presented an opportunity to temporarily use her sleeping bag without technically stealing from a sick person, since she had voluntarily left it behind when she departed for the bathroom. I moved carefully toward Victoria's corner, stepping over the sleeping forms of Madison and Morgan with the same precision that Victoria herself had demonstrated. Her sleeping bag lay open and inviting, still retaining the warmth from her feverish body. The contrast between its obvious comfort and my own cold misery made the decision to appropriate it temporarily seem not only justified but necessary for my survival. As I approached Victoria's meticulously organized sleeping area, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. The sleeping bag was not empty as I had expected. Instead, a human form lay beneath the covers, positioned with the same precise alignment that characterized all of Victoria's arrangements. The sleeping bag was zipped up to neck level, and a head rested on the makeshift pillow, turned away from me toward the wall. Confusion flooded my mind as I tried to process this impossible situation. I had clearly seen Victoria get up, gather her belongings, and leave the shelter 20 minutes earlier. Chloe had witnessed the same sequence of events, confirming that my fever-addled brain wasn't playing tricks on me. Yet here was unmistakable evidence that Victoria had never left her sleeping bag at all. I stood frozen in the darkness, my mind struggling to reconcile what I had observed with what I was seeing. The figure in the sleeping bag was breathing with the same wet, rattling pattern that had characterized Victoria's illness throughout the day. The size and shape of the form beneath the covers matched Victoria's petite frame perfectly. Even the positioning of the body reflected her obsessive need for precise alignment with surrounding structures. My first thought was that I had been hallucinating due to my own developing illness and the stress of our situation. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and worry could easily have caused my brain to create false memories or to misinterpret normal movements as something more significant. But Chloe had seen the same thing, and her illness was less advanced than mine. My second thought was that Victoria had somehow returned while I wasn't paying attention, perhaps while I was focused on navigating around the twins or distracted by my own discomfort. But this explanation didn't account for the timing. Chloe had left to check on Victoria only minutes earlier, and there had been no opportunity for Victoria to return without being seen. As I stood there trying to understand the situation, I heard footsteps approaching across the clearing outside. Chloe was returning from her bathroom expedition, and her pace suggested urgency or distress. I quickly moved away from Victoria's sleeping area and positioned myself near the doorway to hear her report. Chloe pushed through the torn screen with obvious agitation. Her breathing labored from both her illness and her hurried movement across the uneven ground. Her face was flushed with fever and exertion, and her eyes held a confused, frightened expression that matched my own growing unease about the situation. "She's not there," Chloe whispered urgently. I checked both bathroom buildings and walked around the entire area. There's no sign of Victoria anywhere. It's like she just disappeared into thin air. The impossibility of our situation crystallized in my mind as Chloe delivered her report. Victoria was simultaneously absent from the bathroom facilities where we had seen her go and present in her sleeping bag where she had never left. The logical contradictions were giving me a headache that competed with my existing cold symptoms and sleep deprivation. "Chloe," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the darkness, "look at Victoria's sleeping bag." Chloe turned toward Victoria's corner. following my gaze to where the familiar form lay beneath the covers. I watched her face as the same confusion that had gripped me began to register in her expression. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again as she struggled to find words for something that had no logical explanation. "That's impossible," she breathed, moving closer to get a better look at the sleeping figure. We both saw her get up. We both watched her walk to the bathroom. She had her glasses, her water bottle, everything. How can she be here? We stood together in the darkness, staring at Victoria's sleeping form and trying to reconcile our shared memories with the evidence before us. The figure in the sleeping bag continued to breathe with the wet, congested rhythm that had marked Victoria's illness throughout the day. Everything about the scene suggested that she had never moved from her precisely arranged sleeping area. I approached Victoria's sleeping bag with growing trepidation, needing to confirm what my eyes were telling me but fearing what I might discover. As I got closer, I could see that her water bottle, the same one she had carried on her supposed bathroom trip, sat in its designated spot among her other belongings, positioned with the mathematical precision that characterized all her arrangements. "Victoria," I whispered softly, not wanting to wake the other girls but needing to understand what was happening. "Are you okay?" The figure in the sleeping bag stirred slightly at the sound of my voice, turning toward me with movements that seemed sluggish and disoriented. In the dim light filtering through our torn screens, I could see Victoria's face, flushed with fever and wearing the confused expression of someone emerging from deep sleep. Her thick glasses sat on her face in perfect position, despite the fact that I had clearly seen her put them on before leaving the shelter. "What?" Victoria mumbled, her voice thick with congestion and sleep. "What's wrong? What time is it?" "Did you just go to the bathroom?" Chloe asked, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Victoria's confusion deepened as she processed the question. She pushed herself up slightly on her elbows, wincing at the movement, and looked around the shelter as if trying to orient herself. Her gaze moved from Chloe to me, then to the other sleeping girls, before returning to us with growing bewilderment. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice gaining strength as she became more fully awake. "I haven't been anywhere. I've been sleeping here all night. I feel awful. My fever is really high and I can barely breathe. Why would you think I went somewhere?" The certainty in her voice was as disturbing as everything else about the situation. Victoria wasn't lying or trying to cover up a midnight adventure. Her confusion appeared genuine, and her physical condition suggested that she had indeed been lying in her sleeping bag for hours, fighting off the illness that had struck down most of our roommates. Chloe and I exchanged glances that communicated our shared bewilderment and growing fear. We had both witnessed the same sequence of events with crystal clarity. We had seen Victoria rise from her sleeping bag, gather her belongings, and walk purposefully toward the bathroom facilities. We had tracked her movement across the clearing until she disappeared into the distant building. Yet here she was, insisting with complete conviction that she had never moved. "But we saw you," I insisted, my voice rising slightly before I caught myself and returned to a whisper. "You got up around 1:30. You put on your glasses, picked up your water bottle, and walked to the bathroom. We watched you leave." Victoria's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching alarm. She sat up fully, ignoring the obvious discomfort the movement caused her, and stared at us with wide eyes that reflected genuine fear. Her obsessive tendencies kicked in as she began checking her belongings, counting items and verifying their positions with frantic precision. "My glasses never left my face," she said, her voice taking on the rapid, anxious quality that marked her most distressed moments. "My water bottle is exactly where I put it before going to sleep. All my things are in the same positions. I arranged everything specifically, and I would know if anything had been moved." The conviction in her voice was unshakable, but so were our own memories of what we had witnessed. As we stood there in the cold darkness of our inadequate shelter, surrounded by the sounds of sick children and the smell of illness and dampness, we were confronted with a truth that refused to conform to logical explanation. Chloe's developing illness made her more emotional than usual, and I could see tears gathering in her eyes as she struggled to process the situation. The stress of our accommodations, the health crisis affecting our group, and now this inexplicable contradiction between memory and reality was pushing her toward a breakdown that would help no one. "Maybe we're sicker than we thought," she whispered, her voice cracking with strain. Maybe the fever is making us hallucinate or remember things that didn't happen. Maybe we should try to get some sleep and see if everything makes more sense in the morning. But even as she suggested this rational explanation, none of us believed it. Our memories were too vivid, too detailed, too consistent between two different observers to be dismissed as fever dreams or hallucinations. Something had happened in our shelter that night, something that challenged our understanding of reality itself. Victoria settled back into her sleeping bag, but her movements were agitated and her eyes remained wide with fear. She began rearranging her belongings again, checking and rechecking their positions as if the familiar ritual could somehow restore order to a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. As dawn approached and the first gray light began to filter through our torn screens, we remained awake, each lost in our own thoughts about what we had experienced. The official explanation would be that stress and illness had caused a shared delusion, a perfectly rational conclusion that satisfied the adults but failed to account for the precise details we both remembered. Even now, years later, I can recall every detail of that night with perfect clarity. The way Victoria moved with mechanical precision, the sound of her breathing, the exact items she carried, the path she took across the muddy clearing. Chloe remembers the same details, described in the same sequence, with the same disturbing accuracy. We never found a satisfactory explanation for what happened at Cedar Ridge Camp that October night in 2018. Victoria continued to experience unusual incidents throughout her life, as if that moment had opened a door that could never be completely closed. But for Chloe and me, it remains a single inexplicable event that taught us that reality is far more fragile and mysterious than we had ever imagined. The memory still makes me shiver, though whether from cold or fear, I can never be certain. The summer of 2022 marked my 19th birthday, and with it came the annual church retreat to Pine Ridge Camp. I had never attended before, but my parents insisted it would be good for me after the difficult year I'd endured. The drive through the winding mountain roads took 3 hours, each mile taking me further from civilization and deeper into the dense wilderness of northern Colorado. When we finally arrived, the main lodge stood before us like a monument to rustic living. It wasn't just a big cabin, it was massive, a sprawling wooden structure with 20 individual rooms, a communal living area that could house 50 people, an industrial kitchen, and 2 bathrooms that already showed signs of the weekend's heavy use. The building creaked and groaned with every footstep, its aged timber settling with sounds that would later haunt my dreams. I hauled my duffel bag up the narrow staircase to the 2nd floor, where I'd been assigned to room 14. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with identical doors that reminded me of a hospital ward. My room was sparse. 2 twin beds, a single window that looked out toward the hill, and a closet that smelled of mothballs and decades of previous occupants. My roommate Tyler was already there when I arrived, unpacking clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. He was tall and lanky, with dark hair that fell across his eyes and a nervous habit of chewing his fingernails. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared love of horror movies and our mutual skepticism about the retreat's more spiritual activities. That first evening, as we sat in the living room after dinner, I overheard a conversation that would change everything. The living room buzzed with the chatter of 30 teenagers, all trying to make the best of their mandatory spiritual getaway. I was nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee when I caught fragments of a conversation between Brandon and Lucas, 2 seniors from a neighboring town. Their voices dropped to whispers, but in the way that teenagers do when they want others to overhear. Hasn't been touched in 40 years, Brandon was saying, his eyes darting toward the windows that faced the hill. My brother went there 2 summers ago, Lucas replied, leaning forward conspiratorially. Said he heard things that made him pray to God for forgiveness for even thinking about going inside. I couldn't help myself. What are you guys talking about? They exchanged glances before Brandon spoke. The Mafia House. You see that building up on the hill? He pointed through the large picture window, and I followed his gaze. There, perhaps half a mile up the slope, stood a 3-story house that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Even from this distance, I could see broken windows and a roof that sagged in the middle like a broken spine. "Why do you call it the Mafia House?" I asked, settling into a chair closer to them. Lucas's voice dropped even lower. "Back in the late 70s, the story goes, it belonged to a family connected to organized crime out of Denver. The whole family disappeared one winter. Parents, 3 kids, even their dog. Police found evidence of a struggle, but no bodies. The rumor is they're all still up there, hidden away in the attic, waiting for someone to find them." Tyler had joined us by now, and I could see the skepticism in his eyes even as his face showed interest. "That's just small-town legend stuff," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Brandon continued, "but weird stuff happens around there. Lights in the windows at night when there's no electricity, sounds carrying down the hill on windless nights. And anyone who's ever gone inside, well, let's just say they don't stay long." The room had grown quiet around us, other conversations dying as people leaned in to listen. The silence was broken only by the old lodge settling around us, creating a symphony of creaks and groans that suddenly seemed more ominous than before. That night, I lay in my narrow bed staring at the ceiling while Tyler's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, but rest wouldn't come for me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that house on the hill, its broken windows like hollow eye sockets staring down at us. The logical part of my brain knew it was just an old building, probably dangerous from years of neglect, but something deeper kept pulling my thoughts back to it. The next morning dawned gray and humid, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like a burial shroud. During breakfast, I found myself sitting with Brandon, Lucas, Miguel, and Jordan, all of them drawn together by the previous night's conversation. Tyler joined us reluctantly, still expressing doubt about the whole thing. "We should go up there," I said suddenly, surprising myself with the words. The table fell silent, forks pausing halfway to mouths. "Are you insane?" Miguel asked, his dark eyes wide. "Didn't you hear what Brandon said last night?" "That's exactly why we should go," I pressed on, feeling a strange compulsion I couldn't explain. "If it's just old stories, we prove it. If there's really something there," I let the sentence hang. "Then we run like hell," Jordan finished, but I could hear the curiosity beneath his bravado. Tyler shook his head. "This is a bad idea. These places are dangerous even without any supernatural nonsense. Rotting floorboards, unstable stairs, who knows what kind of animals have made it their home." But the seed had been planted. By lunch, we had a plan. That afternoon, during the scheduled rest period, we would make our reconnaissance. We'd find a way in, take a quick look around, and satisfy our curiosity. What could go wrong? As afternoon approached, storm clouds gathered overhead, casting the entire camp in a premature twilight that made the house on the hill look even more foreboding. The wind picked up, sending the pine trees into a frenzied dance that sounded like whispered warnings. The 6 of us set out just after 2 o'clock, when most of the other retreat participants were either napping or engaged in quiet study time. We took the long way around the lodge to avoid being seen by the counselors, following a barely visible trail that wound up the hillside through dense stands of pine and aspen. The closer we got to the house, the more wrong everything felt. The trees around the property grew differently, twisted and stunted, as if the soil itself was somehow poisoned. No birds sang in these branches, and the usual forest sounds faded to an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even our footsteps. When we finally reached the edge of the property, we crouched behind a fallen log to study our target. Up close, the house was even more disturbing than it had appeared from the lodge. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood underneath gray and weathered. Several windows were broken, their jagged glass catching what little light filtered through the clouds. The front porch sagged dangerously, and I could see holes in the roof where animals had likely taken up residence. Tyler and I volunteered to circle the building and look for a way in while the others kept watch. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock that looked newer than everything else around it. Someone had wanted to keep people out, or perhaps keep something in. The back door was boarded up with planks that were nailed so tightly I couldn't even get my fingers between them. It was Tyler who found the basement entrance on the side of the house. Unlike the other entrances, This one was simply a metal door set into a concrete frame, with a handle that turned easily despite the rust coating its surface. We looked at each other, and I saw my own mixture of excitement and terror reflected in his eyes. "This is it," I whispered. We found our way in. When we reported back to the group, the mood changed immediately. The adventure had suddenly become real, and with reality came fear. "The basement?" Brandon's voice cracked slightly. "You want us to go in through the basement?" "It's just a door," I said, but even I could hear how unconvincing I sounded. There was something about that metal door that felt wrong, like it was an entrance to somewhere we weren't meant to go. Lucas was already shaking his head. "I can't do it, man. I thought we were just going to look around the outside, maybe peek through some windows, but actually going inside." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. One by one, they all backed out. Miguel mumbled something about needing to get back before the counselors noticed we were gone. Jordan claimed he'd forgotten about a phone call he needed to make. Even Brandon, who had started this whole thing with his stories, suddenly remembered urgent responsibilities back at the lodge. Tyler and I watched them retreat down the hill, their relief visible in the way their shoulders relaxed as they put distance between themselves and the house. When they were out of sight, Tyler turned to me with conflicted eyes. "Maybe they're right," he said quietly. "Maybe we should just let this go. We've satisfied our curiosity. We found a way in. That's enough, isn't it?" But it wasn't enough for me. The compulsion that had been building since the previous night had grown stronger, not weaker. Standing there in front of that house, I felt like I was being pulled toward it by invisible threads. "You can go back if you want," I told him, "but I'm going in." Tyler studied my face for a long moment, then sighed. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" "Yes." "Then I'm coming with you. Someone needs to make sure you don't do anything stupider than you're already doing." But even as he said it, I could see the fear in his eyes growing stronger. And as we made our way back to the lodge to get our flashlights and prepare for our exploration, I noticed him glancing back at the house with an expression that looked almost like terror. The next day was our last at Pine Ridge, and the atmosphere at the lodge was bittersweet as people prepared to say their goodbyes. Most of the group was scheduled to leave by early afternoon, which gave Tyler and me the perfect cover for our exploration. We told anyone who asked that we were going to shoot some hoops at the outdoor basketball court, and even started a game with a few other guys to maintain the illusion. Halfway through the game, Tyler started showing signs of serious doubt. He kept glancing up at the house on the hill, and I could see sweat on his forehead that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. During a natural break in the game, he pulled me aside. "I can't stop thinking about this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All night I kept waking up and looking out the window at that place, and I swear I saw lights moving around inside." "You were dreaming," I replied, but my own sleep had been restless, filled with images of dark hallways and hidden rooms. "Maybe. But what if I wasn't? What if there's someone living up there? Someone who doesn't want visitors? What if we're not just trespassing, but walking into something dangerous?" I could see him building up to something, and I didn't like where this was heading. "Tyler, we agreed." "I know what we agreed," he interrupted, "but I'm changing my mind. This whole thing feels wrong. We might get in serious trouble with the church leaders. We might get hurt. Hell, what if all those stories are true and we really do encounter something we can't handle?" The frustration that had been building in me finally boiled over. "Are you seriously backing out now? After everything we talked about?" He looked genuinely pained by my anger, but his resolve didn't waver. "Yes, I guess I am. I'm sorry, but I just can't do it." Without another word, I turned and walked away from the basketball court, my anger propelling me toward the hill. I didn't look back to see Tyler's expression, didn't want to give him another chance to talk me out of what I knew I had to do. By the time I reached the house, my anger had cooled into cold determination. Standing in front of that basement door again, I felt the weight of the moment. This was my last chance to turn back, to rejoin Tyler and the others, and pretend this had all been just talk. Instead, I reached for the handle. The metal door opened with a groan that seemed to echo from deep within the earth itself. Beyond the threshold lay absolute darkness, and the smell that wafted out made my stomach turn. It was the scent of decay and neglect, But underneath it was something else, something organic and wrong that I couldn't identify. I stepped inside and immediately felt the temperature drop by what must have been 20 degrees. The air was thick and humid, clinging to my skin like cobwebs. I closed the door behind me, partly to prevent anyone from discovering our entry point, but mostly because some primitive instinct told me I needed to seal myself in completely to do what I had come to do. My LED flashlight cut through the darkness like a sword, revealing a basement that defied logical layout. The concrete walls were stained with moisture and something darker that could have been rust or could have been something far worse. The boiler that Tyler and I had spotted through a window dominated one corner, its pipes snaking across the ceiling like metallic intestines, but it was the piles of debris scattered around the room that made my heart start racing. The first pile contained what looked like normal household discards, old clothes, empty bottles, newspapers so old the paper had turned yellow. But as I moved deeper into the basement, the collections became more disturbing. Children's toys from decades past lay in rotting heaps. Dolls with missing eyes, toy cars with paint scraped away to reveal bare metal. Wind-up toys that looked like they might start moving at any moment. The smell grew stronger as I advanced, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. My flashlight beam caught something that made me stop cold. A child's rocking horse, its paint peeling, and one rocker completely rotted away, sitting alone in the center of the room as if placed there deliberately. That's when I heard the first sound from above. It started as a single creak, like someone taking a cautious step on old floorboards. I froze, listening intently, but for several seconds there was nothing but the sound of my own rapid breathing. Then it came again, not just one footstep, but a pattern of movement, someone pacing slowly back and forth directly over my head. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it pulsing in my throat. The footsteps above weren't random. They had purpose, moving in a deliberate pattern from one end of what must have been the main room to the other, then back again. Each step seemed to vibrate through the house's frame and into my bones. I stood motionless, afraid that any sound I made would give away my presence to whoever was up there. My flashlight felt heavy in my sweating palm, and I realized I was gripping it so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The pacing continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. In that complete quiet, I became aware of every tiny noise, the drip of water somewhere in the darkness, the settling of the old house around me, my own shallow breathing. Then, cutting through the silence like a blade, came the unmistakable sound of a door opening somewhere above me, followed immediately by the crash of it slamming shut. I didn't wait to hear more. Terror finally overcame curiosity, and I ran for the basement door, not caring about the noise I made crashing through the obstacles in my path. My foot caught on one of the pipes, sending me sprawling across the concrete floor. My flashlight flew from my hand and clicked off as it hit the wall, plunging me into complete darkness. Panic took over completely. I scrambled across the floor on my hands and knees, feeling frantically for the flashlight while the sounds above me started again. But this time they weren't on the first floor. This time they were coming down toward the basement, heavy footsteps on wooden stairs I hadn't even noticed in my initial exploration. My fingers finally closed around the flashlight, and by some miracle it clicked back on when I pressed the button. Without looking back toward the stairs, I ran for the door, fumbling with the handle before finally getting it open. The gray daylight outside seemed blinding after the basement darkness, and I kept running until I reached the safety of the lodge. Tyler was waiting in our room when I burst through the door, and the look on my face must have told him everything he needed to know. I gasped out my story between ragged breaths, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. Neither did the others when I told them later. As we loaded our bags into the church van for the trip home, I couldn't resist one last look at the house on the hill, and there, framed in one of the upper-story windows, was the unmistakable silhouette of a man. I blinked, certain I was imagining it, but when I looked again, he was gone. That was 3 years ago, and I've never returned to Pine Ridge. But the house hasn't forgotten about me. Ever since that day, I've been hearing sounds in my own home. Footsteps in the hallway at night, doors closing when no one else is around, and sometimes, when the house is very quiet, the sound of someone pacing slowly back and forth in the room directly above wherever I happened to be sitting. I've never told anyone about these sounds. Who would believe me? But I know the truth. Some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed listening to the footsteps above me, I wonder if the man in that window is still waiting for someone to come back and finish what they started. July 4th, 1999. A date forever etched in my memory. I'm Carter Reynolds, and this is my story. It's not an easy one to tell, but I feel compelled to share it, if only to warn others about what might be lurking in the shadows of our world. I had been living in my grandfather's old cabin, nestled deep in the Ozark mountain forests of Arkansas, for about 6 months. After leaving the military, I craved solitude and a quiet place to readjust to civilian life. The cabin, with its rustic charm and isolation, seemed perfect. Most days were peaceful. I'd spend my time fishing in the nearby lake, hiking the surrounding trails, or working on repairs around the property. The routine was comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos and unpredictability of my time in service. Nights were my favorite. I'd sit out on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, watching for deer and other wildlife. My grandfather's old .30-30 rifle was always nearby. I rarely used it, but its presence was reassuring, a connection to the past and a safeguard against the unknown. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy. 2 rooms, a main living area with a small kitchen, and a bedroom. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 yards from the back door. Solar panels on the roof provided enough electricity for basic necessities and a well-supplied fresh water. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home. As July 4th approached, I noticed some activity at the old Peterson place down the mountain. A family had arrived for the holiday weekend, a brother and sister, both older than me, with 2 kids who seemed to have endless energy. I'd seen them around a few times, exchanging polite nods, but we generally kept to ourselves. That's how it was out here. Everyone respected each other's space. The night of the 4th started like any other. I was on my porch, watching distant fireworks light up the sky. The Peterson family had a bonfire going, and I could hear faint laughter and the occasional pop of smaller fireworks. It was a perfect summer night, warm with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Little did I know that this idyllic scene was about to shatter, plunging me into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. It was around 9:30 p.m. when I first heard it, a rustling in the woods to my right. Too heavy to be a deer or coyote. My first thought was a bear. They weren't uncommon in the area, but they usually stayed closer to the lake, away from human activity. Concerned about the possibility of a bear wandering near the Peterson place with kids around, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my grandfather's rifle and stepped off the porch onto the dry grass. The night was clear, a full moon casting long shadows across the yard. As I approached the tree line, the rustling grew louder. Leaves crunched under heavy footsteps. Branches snapped. Whatever it was big. I raised the rifle, my heart rate picking up. "Hey there," I called out, trying to sound calm. "Why don't you head on back to the woods?" That's when I saw it. A massive form emerged from behind a thick oak tree, and I felt my blood run cold. It wasn't a bear. It was far too tall, easily 7 or 8 feet high. Its body was hunched and covered in dark, coarse hair. But it was the creature's face that seared itself into my memory. Its head was elongated, almost wolf-like, with a protruding snout filled with sharp teeth. And the eyes, God, those eyes. They caught the moonlight and gleamed a deep, unnatural red. I'd never seen anything like it in all my years in these woods or during my time in the military. I froze, my finger hovering over the rifle's trigger. The creature tilted its head, studying me with an unsettling intelligence. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, in a blur of motion that belied its size, it vanished back into the tree line. I stood there, stunned, my heart pounding in my ears. What the hell had I just seen? My mind raced through possibilities. A bear with some kind of deformity, a mountain lion, even a person in some elaborate costume. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit. The distant sound of laughter from the Peterson place snapped me back to reality. Whatever that thing was, it was heading in their direction. I had to warn them. I started down the path towards the Peterson property, my steps quickening as adrenaline coursed through my veins. The rifle felt heavy in my hands, and I found myself questioning whether I had actually seen what I thought I saw. Maybe the isolation was getting to me, playing tricks on my mind. Those doubts evaporated the moment I heard the first scream. It was high-pitched, clearly one of the children. Then a woman's voice, shouting in panic. And beneath it all, a deep, guttural roar that sent chills down my spine. It was the same creature I had seen. I was sure of it. I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face as I tore through the underbrush. The sounds of chaos grew louder, more screaming, the crash of something heavy moving through the woods, and that terrible, inhuman growling. As I burst into the clearing where the Peterson family had set up their campfire, the scene before me was like something out of a nightmare. The creature I had seen earlier was there, its massive form hunched over a small, writhing figure on the ground. With horror, I realized it was the young boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old. The child was screaming, desperately trying to crawl away from the monster's grasp. Long, wickedly curved claws swiped at his legs, leaving bloody gashes in their wake. A few yards away, the boy's parents were circling frantically, throwing rocks and shouting in a futile attempt to distract the beast. And then I saw her. The little girl, the boy's sister, lay motionless in the creature's other arm, her head lolled to one side, her blonde hair matted with blood. I felt bile rise in my throat, but there was no time for shock or hesitation. I raised the rifle to my shoulder, aiming for the center of the creature's mass. The .330 roared, the sound echoing through the woods. The beast bellowed in pain and anger, dropping the girl's body as it clutched at its now mangled arm. The boy seized his chance, scrambling away with a final terrified scream. His mother, who I now remembered was named Melissa, rushed to the fallen girl. The father, Nchabrptam, I recalled, was shouting something at me, waving his arms wildly towards the woods. "Get out of here, run!" But I couldn't leave them defenseless. I chambered another round, preparing to fire again. The creature, however, had other plans. Those hellish red eyes fixed on me, and with a speed that seemed impossible for its size, it charged. I fired again, but in the chaos and dim light my shot went wide. In an instant it was upon me. I swung the rifle up, using it as a makeshift shield. The butt of the gun connected with a clawed hand reaching for my throat, deflecting it just enough. But I wasn't fast enough to avoid the other massive paw that raked across my chest and shoulder. Pain exploded through my body as I felt the creature's claws tear through flesh and muscle. The force of the blow sent me sprawling to the ground, my vision blurring from the shock and agony. I looked up to see the monster looming over me, its foul breath hot on my face. Drool dripped from its enormous sharp-toothed maw. This was it, I thought. After surviving war zones and coming home to find peace, I was going to die here in the dirt, ripped apart by some ungodly beast in the Ozark backwoods. Just as the creature reared back for what I was sure would be the killing blow, another gunshot rang out. Not from my rifle, but a deeper, more powerful blast. The monster jerked back, howling in pain and rage. Through my haze of pain, I saw Tom. He stood a few yards away, his face a mask of terror and determination. Wielding a shotgun, he fired again and again, each blast causing the creature to stagger and shriek. "Carter," Tom shouted, his voice barely audible over the monster's wails and the ringing in my ears. "Run, get help." Adrenaline surged through me, momentarily dampening the burning agony in my chest and shoulder. I scrambled to my feet, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through my body. But I knew I had to move, had to get away and find help. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing blindly through the dark woods. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step, but I didn't slow down. Behind me, I could still hear the creature's roars and Tom's shotgun blasts, but they grew fainter as I put distance between us. I had no idea if I was heading in the right direction, if I was going deeper into the wilderness or back towards civilization. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to find help before it was too late for the Peterson family. I don't know how long I ran. Time became meaningless, measured only in ragged breaths and the pounding of my heart. The pain in my chest was excruciating, each step sending fresh jolts of agony through my body. But the fear of what lay behind me was greater than any physical discomfort. Eventually, I stumbled upon the rough dirt road that led back to my cabin. A surge of relief washed over me. Momentarily pushing aside the pain and exhaustion, I forced myself onward, knowing that my phone, my link to the outside world and potential help, was waiting in the cabin. As I approached the familiar clearing, I saw the outline of my cabin against the star-filled sky. It had never looked so welcoming. I staggered up the porch steps, fumbling with the door handle. My vision was starting to blur, black spots dancing at the edges. I practically fell through the doorway, my bloodied hand leaving a smear on the frame. I tried to call out, to explain about the creature and the Peterson family, but the words caught in my raw, burning throat. The last thing I remember is collapsing against the wall, the world fading to darkness around me. I woke up in the county hospital, disoriented and in pain. The next few days passed in a haze of morphine, worried doctors and confused questions. I drifted in and out of consciousness, plagued by nightmares of glowing red eyes and savage claws. When I was finally lucid enough to string together coherent thoughts, a county sheriff named Grady came to see me. He was a stocky man with a thick Ozark accent and eyes that had seen too much. He'd heard my delirious ramblings when I was brought in, and at first I think he wrote them off as the product of shock and blood loss. But something had changed his mind. Tom Peterson had survived the attack and made it back to his home. He corroborated my story, describing the creature in chilling detail that matched my own recollections. The reality of what we'd seen was too terrifying, too unbelievable, for either of us to have made it up. Grady told me they'd launched a search. He'd called in reinforcements, even alerted the National Guard. They went into those woods armed to the teeth, tracked for 2 solid days, but they found nothing. No fur, no blood, no tracks. Nothing to justify the hunt or explain what had happened that night. The official story was that it had been a bear attack, possibly a large cat that had wandered out of its usual territory. The fireworks, they said, must have spooked it, causing it to lash out. It was easier to believe, I suppose, than the truth. But I knew what I had seen, and so did Tom. The little girl hadn't survived. Her name was Lily, and she was only 6 years old. Her brother Michael was physically recovering from his injuries, but the trauma of that night would likely stay with him forever. The Petersons left the area soon after, disappearing without a trace. I don't blame them. I couldn't stay either. As soon as I was well enough to leave the hospital, I sold the cabin. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there, of living with the memories and the fear of what might still be lurking in those woods. I moved to the city, surrounded myself with noise and people and light, anything to keep the darkness at bay. But the scars remained, both physical and mental. The long gashes across my chest and shoulder healed into thick, ropey scars that ached when the weather changed. The nightmares came less frequently as the years passed, but they never truly went away. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom sensation of hot breath on my face, and the sound of inhuman growls echoing in my ears. In the years that followed, I became obsessed with finding an explanation for what had happened that night. I scoured local newspapers, online forums, and obscure cryptozoology websites, searching for any hint of similar encounters. I reached out to wildlife experts, folklorists, and even a few self-proclaimed monster hunters, hoping someone could shed light on what we had seen. Most dismissed my story outright. A few suggested it might have been a particularly large black bear with some kind of deformity or disease. Others proposed more outlandish theories, everything from escaped government experiments to interdimensional beings. None of it felt right. I tried to track down the Peterson family, hoping to compare notes with Tom or see how they were coping, but it was like they had vanished into thin air. No forwarding address, no social media presence, nothing. It was as if they were running from something, trying to erase all traces of their existence. My search led me down some dark paths. I found myself in seedy bars on the outskirts of small Ozark towns. listening to hushed stories of things that shouldn't exist. I hiked into remote areas, following vague leads and half-remembered sightings. More than once I found myself alone in the woods as night fell, my heart racing at every snapped twig or rustling leaf. But I never found any concrete evidence. No photographs, no DNA samples, nothing that could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that what Tom and I had seen was real. The lack of proof was maddening, but in a way it was also a relief. Part of me didn't want to confirm that such a creature truly existed. As the years passed, my obsession gradually faded. I still kept an eye on the news from that region, still felt a chill when I heard about unexplained disappearances or strange animal sightings. But I learned to live with the uncertainty, to accept that some questions might never be answered. It's been 25 years since that night in the Ozarks. I'm older now, my hair graying at the temples, the scars on my chest faded to silver lines. I've built a life for myself, found some measure of peace, but I've never forgotten. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right, or when I'm alone in the dark, I'm transported back to that moment. I can smell the pine needles and feel the humid summer air on my skin. I can hear the creatures growl, see those glowing red eyes in the shadows. I don't know if what we encountered that night was some unknown species, a freak of nature, or something beyond our understanding. I don't know if it's still out there, lurking in the deep woods, waiting for another unfortunate soul to cross its path. Part of me hopes it died from its wounds, that the nightmare ended that night, but another part of me knows better. The world is vast and full of mysteries. There are dark corners where ancient things still dwell, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. Most people go through their lives never glimpsing what lies beyond the veil of the ordinary, and maybe that's for the best. But for those of us who have seen it, who have felt the touch of the unknown, the world is never quite the same. We walk with one foot in shadow, always aware that the impossible might be waiting just around the corner. So if you find yourself in the wilderness, whether it's the Ozark Mountains or any other remote place, remember this story. Be aware of your surroundings. Listen to your instincts. And if you hear something moving in the dark, something too big to be a deer or a bear, don't investigate. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to be a hero. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because some things in this world aren't meant to be understood or confronted. I've often wondered why I survived that night when others didn't. Was it luck? Fate? Or was I spared for a reason? To be a witness, perhaps. To carry this story and its warning to others who might listen. Last year, I received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief handwritten note. Carter, it's still out there. Be careful. T. No return address, no further explanation. But I knew immediately who it was from. Tom Peterson, reaching out after all these years. The message sent a chill down my spine, confirming my deepest fears. Whatever we encountered that night wasn't a one-time occurrence. It wasn't some freak accident or a creature that had since died or been captured. It was still out there. I debated long and hard about what to do with this information. Should I alert the authorities, try to mount another search, or simply keep the knowledge to myself, buried deep like so many other secrets? In the end, I decided to share my story, not with the police or the media, but with you, whoever you are, reading these words. Because knowledge is power, and in this case, it might just save your life. I don't expect you to believe everything I've written here. Hell, there are days I have trouble believing it myself, but I ask you to keep an open mind, to remember that the world is bigger and stranger than we often allow ourselves to imagine. And if you ever find yourself in the wilderness, whether it's the Ozarks or anywhere else, and you hear something moving in the shadows, something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, and your heart race, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Trust your instincts. They might just save your life. As for me, I've made my peace with what happened. I can't change the past, can't bring back those we lost that terrible night. But I can honor their memory by sharing this story, by keeping the truth alive. I still dream about it sometimes. About red eyes gleaming in the darkness, about claws and teeth and terror. But I've learned to live with those dreams. to use them as a reminder of the thin line between the world we think we know and the shadows that lie beyond. So I'll keep watching, keep listening, and if I ever hear of another sighting, another encounter with something that shouldn't exist, I'll be ready, not to fight it. I learned that lesson the hard way, but to warn others, to keep the memory alive. Because out there, in the deep woods and dark hollows, something is waiting, something ancient and terrible and hungry, and it's patient, oh so patient. So be careful out there. Watch the shadows, listen to the silence, and remember, not all monsters are mere legends. Some of them are all too real. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 28 years old, still trying to find my place in the world. My name is George Moore, and back then I was just another face in the crowd, working a mundane office job in Pittsburgh. My days were filled with endless spreadsheets and the monotonous hum of fluorescent lights. Home wasn't much better, a small, run-down apartment that always smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how much I cleaned. It was the summer of 1998, and I was 28 years old, still trying to find my place in the world. My name is George Moore, and back then I was just another face in the crowd, working a mundane office job in Pittsburgh. My days were filled with endless spreadsheets and the monotonous hum of fluorescent lights. Home wasn't much better, a small, run-down apartment that always smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how much I cleaned. To escape the suffocating confines of city life, I spent most of my free time in nature. Fishing and hiking became my refuges, offering moments of peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. There was something about the stillness of the woods, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, that soothed my restless soul. Maybe it was the quiet that allowed me to hear my own thoughts, or perhaps it was the reminder that there was a world beyond the concrete jungle I called home. I wasn't much for socializing. Large gatherings made me uncomfortable, and I often found myself retreating to the corners of rooms, nursing a drink and counting the minutes until I could leave. It wasn't that I disliked people, I just found solace in solitude. One particularly dreary Tuesday, as I sat at my desk, mindlessly inputting data into yet another spreadsheet, my phone rang. It was my old college buddy, Dave Mendoza. Dave was one of the few people I kept in touch with from my university days. He was a big guy, both in stature and personality, with a booming laugh that could fill a room. "George, my man." Dave's voice crackled through the receiver. "How's life treating you?" I leaned back in my chair, grateful for the distraction. "Oh, you know, same old, same old. What's up, Dave?" "Listen, I've got a proposition for you," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "A couple of friends and I are heading up to my family's cabin in the Allegheny National Forest this weekend. How about you join us?" "Come on, George. You need to get out more." I hesitated. While the thought of escaping the city was tempting, the idea of spending a weekend with people I didn't know well made me uneasy. Sensing my reluctance, Dave pressed on. "The cabin's got this old-school charm and the fishing's great. Plus, it'll be just like old times. A cooler full of beer, a campfire, and no responsibilities. What do you say?" I found myself chuckling despite my reservations. All right. I could use a break from staring at spreadsheets all day." "That's the spirit," Dave exclaimed. "I'll pick you up Friday afternoon. Pack light, and don't forget your fishing gear." As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. It had been years since I'd done anything spontaneous like this. Part of me worried about spending so much time with people, but another part, a part I hadn't heard from in a while, was looking forward to the adventure. The rest of the week dragged on, each day seeming longer than the last. By the time Friday rolled around, I was more than ready to leave the city behind. I packed a small duffel bag with some clothes, grabbed my trusty fishing rod, and waited for Dave to arrive. At precisely 3 p.m., I heard the unmistakable rumble of Dave's old Ford Bronco pulling up outside my apartment building. I locked up and headed down, my anticipation growing with each step. Dave greeted me with a bear hug as soon as I stepped outside.
"George, man, it's good to see you." He helped me toss my bag in the back of the Bronco, where I noticed 2 other bags were already stowed.
"Hope you don't mind, but we're making a couple of stops to pick up the rest of the crew." Dave said as we climbed into the vehicle. I nodded, trying to quell the anxiety that was beginning to bubble up in my chest. No problem. Who else is coming? My cousin Tom and his buddy Ken, Dave replied, pulling away from the curb. You'll like them. Tom's a riot, and Ken, well, Ken's Ken. You'll see. As we drove through the city, Dave filled me in on what he'd been up to since we last met. He was working as a high school gym teacher, a job that seemed to suit his outgoing personality perfectly. He regaled me with stories of troublesome students and ridiculous staff meetings, his laughter filling the car. Our first stop was in a quiet suburban neighborhood. A wiry guy with a mop of curly hair bounded down the front steps of a modest house, a backpack slung over one shoulder and a six-pack of beer in his free hand. George, meet my cousin Tom, Dave said as Tom clambered into the back seat. Tom reached forward to shake my hand. Nice to meet you, George. Dave's told me all about your college adventures. I shot Dave a questioning look, wondering exactly what stories he'd been sharing, but he just grinned and pulled back onto the road. Our final stop was at an apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. Ken, as it turned out, was built like a linebacker, all broad shoulders and thick arms. He nodded a silent greeting as he squeezed into the back seat next to Tom. As we left the city behind, the conversation flowed freely. Tom, true to Dave's description, was indeed a riot. He had an endless supply of jokes and funny stories that kept us entertained. Ken, on the other hand, rarely spoke unless it was to make a particularly insightful comment. We stopped at a small town store on the way to stock up on supplies. Dave insisted on buying more beer, chips, and some canned goods just in case. He even threw a couple of fishing rods into our cart, despite my protests that I'd brought my own gear. Trust me, George, he said with a wink. You can never have too many rods when you're fishing with this bunch. As we drove deeper into the Allegheny National Forest, the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The road became narrower and rougher, the old Bronco bouncing and rattling as Dave navigated the uneven terrain. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving, Dave announced, "We're here, boys." The cabin came into view as we rounded a final bend in the road. It was a cozy, rustic structure nestled among towering pine trees. The wooden building had clearly seen better days. The paint was peeling in places, and one of the shutters hung at a slight angle, but it had a certain charm that was undeniable. As we piled out of the car, stretching our legs and breathing in the crisp forest air, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a whippoorwill. "Welcome to Casa de Mendoza," Dave announced, spreading his arms wide. "Let's get unpacked and settled in. The real fun starts tomorrow." As I grabbed my bag from the Bronco, I couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. Despite my initial reservations, I had a feeling this weekend was going to be an adventure to remember. Little did I know just how right I would be, and how much I would come to wish I'd never set foot in those woods. The interior of the cabin was just as rustic as its exterior. The main room was open plan, with a small kitchen area in one corner, and a living space dominated by a large stone fireplace. 2 doors led off to what I assumed were bedrooms, and a narrow staircase hugged one wall, leading to what Dave informed us was a loft space. "All right, gentlemen," Dave announced as we dropped our bags. "Tom and Ken, you guys take the loft. George, you can have the small bedroom at the back. I'll bunk down here in the main room." I nodded, grateful for the private space. As much as I was enjoying the company, I knew I'd need some time alone to recharge. We spent the next hour unpacking and settling in. Dave got a fire going in the fireplace, filling the cabin with warmth and the comforting scent of burning wood. Tom busied himself in the kitchen, unpacking our supplies and cracking open beers for everyone. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, cold beers in hand. The conversation flowed easily, fueled by alcohol and the excitement of being away from the daily grind. Dave and Tom swapped stories about their family, filling me in on inside jokes and shared memories. Even Ken opened up a bit, his deep voice rumbling as he contributed to the conversation. "So, George," Tom said during a lull in the conversation, "Dave tells us you're quite the fisherman. Any good stories?" I chuckled, taking a swig of my beer. Well, there was this one time, and so the night went on. Stories were told, each one getting taller with every round of drinks. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business. As the night wore on, and the beers took their toll, we eventually decided to turn in. Tomorrow would be a full day, and we needed our rest. I made my way to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. It was a cozy space, just big enough for a single bed and a small dresser. A narrow window looked out into the dense forest behind the cabin. As I got ready for bed, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. Despite my initial reservations, I was glad I'd come on this trip. Sleep came easily that night, aided by the beer and the fresh mountain air. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a natural part of the forest symphony. But then I heard it again, an eerie melodic whistle, faint but distinct. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The sound seemed to be coming from the woods, growing slightly louder before fading away again. My heart began to pound in my chest. I debated whether I should wake the others, but decided against it. They'd probably just laugh it off, and I didn't want to be the butt of the joke in the morning. Eventually, the sound faded away completely, and I managed to drift back into an uneasy sleep. When I woke again, sunlight was streaming through the window, and I could hear the others moving about in the main room. I got dressed and joined them, the memory of the strange whistle still lingering in my mind. Dave was at the stove frying up some bacon and eggs. The smell made my stomach growl, reminding me how long it had been since dinner. "Morning, Sleeping Beauty," Dave grinned as I entered the room. "Sleep well?" I hesitated for a moment before replying. "Yeah, mostly. Though I heard something weird in the middle of the night." Tom looked up from where he was setting the table. "Weird how?" "It sounded like whistling," I said, feeling a bit foolish. "Coming from the woods." Dave chuckled, flipping the bacon. "Probably just the wind, George. Or maybe your mind playing tricks on you after those stories last night." "Yeah, maybe," I replied, though I wasn't entirely convinced. We ate breakfast, the conversation turning to our plans for the day. Dave suggested we hike to a nearby lake that he swore was teeming with fish. The idea of spending a day by the water, rod in hand, sounded perfect to me. After breakfast, we packed some supplies, sandwiches, snacks, and of course more beer, and set off into the woods. The trail was overgrown, clearly not used very often. We had to push through thick underbrush in places, the leaves and branches slapping against our legs and arms. The deeper we went into the forest, the quieter it seemed to get. The cheerful birdsong that had accompanied our departure from the cabin gradually faded away, replaced by an eerie stillness. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves beneath our feet and our own labored breathing as we climbed steep inclines. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. I tried to rationalize it, probably just a squirrel or a deer, I told myself. But the uneasy feeling persisted. After what felt like hours of hiking, we finally reached the lake. It was a beautiful spot, a clear blue expanse of water surrounded by dense forest. The surface was like glass, reflecting the trees and sky in perfect detail. We spent the day fishing and joking around, the unease of the hike forgotten in the joy of the catch. I even managed to land a couple of decent-sized trout, which we decided to keep for dinner. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, we packed up our gear and started the trek back to the cabin. The forest seemed different in the fading light, the shadows deeper and more menacing. That feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. We reached the cabin just as darkness fell, all of us tired but in good spirits from a successful day of fishing. Dave started a fire outside, while Tom and Ken prepped the fish for grilling. I offered to help, but Dave waved me off. "Relax, George," he said. "You caught the fish. Least we can do is cook 'em." So I sat by the fire, nursing a beer and watching the flames dance. As we ate our freshly grilled fish, the conversation turned to local legends and ghost stories, as it often does in settings like that. "You ever hear about the Whistler?" Dave asked, his voice low and dramatic. I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering the sound that had woken me the night before. The whistler? Dave nodded, his face eerily lit by the flickering firelight. It's an old legend around these parts. They say there's a creature that roams these woods, luring people deeper and deeper with its haunting whistle. Ken, who had been quiet for most of the evening, suddenly spoke up. It's not just a legend. People have gone missing in these woods, never to be found. We all turned to look at him, surprised by his serious tone. Come on, Ken, I laughed nervously. You trying to scare us or what? Ken's face remained impassive. I'm just saying, man. People go missing in these woods. Could be anything out there. A heavy silence fell over our group. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky. In the distance, an owl hooted, the sound eerily reminiscent of the whistle I'd heard the night before. Eventually, the chill of the night drove us back into the cabin. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The stories, combined with my experience from the night before and the strange sensations during our hike, swirled in my mind. Just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, I heard it again. The whistle, faint at first but growing louder. It seemed to be coming from just outside my window. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was clearer now, a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. I debated waking the others, but something held me back. What if it was nothing? What if I was just letting my imagination run wild? The whistle continued, rising and falling in pitch, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. It was as if whatever was making the sound was circling the cabin. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear, listening to that unearthly sound. Eventually it faded away, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, had me on edge. By the time morning came, I was exhausted and on edge. At breakfast, I mentioned the sound to Dave. He listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. Look, George, he said finally. I'm not saying you didn't hear something, but these woods play tricks on you, especially at night. It was probably just the wind or some animal. I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew it was something more. Something was out there in those woods, and I had a sinking feeling that we were about to find out exactly what it was. The day started much like the previous one. We ate a hearty breakfast, the mood lighter in the morning sunlight. Dave suggested we hike to a different spot, a secluded stream he claimed was perfect for fly fishing. Despite my lingering unease, I agreed. The thought of spending another day in the peaceful wilderness was appealing, and I hoped it would help shake off the remnants of my fears from the night before. We set off mid-morning, our backpacks laden with supplies. The forest seemed less oppressive in the daylight, sunlight filtering through the canopy and dappling the forest floor. Birds chirped overhead, and occasionally we'd spot a squirrel darting up a tree trunk. As we hiked, I found myself hyper-aware of our surroundings. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf had me on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. I tried to rationalize it. We were in the woods, after all. There were bound to be animals around, but the feeling persisted, a constant prickle at the back of my neck. We had been walking for about an hour when Dave suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for silence. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all stood still, straining our ears. For a moment, all I could hear was the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the pounding of my own heart. Then I heard it, a faint melodic whistle, barely audible but unmistakable. "There it is again," Tom said, his voice hushed. "What is that?" "Probably just a bird," Ken grunted, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Dave shook his head slowly. "I've never heard a bird that sounded like that." The whistle came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of us, deeper in the woods. Despite my fear, I found myself oddly drawn to the sound. It was haunting, beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, fighting against the strange pull of the music. Dave hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, maybe you're right. This is starting to feel a bit..." He never finished his sentence. One moment he was standing there, and the next he was gone, yanked backwards into the underbrush with a strangled cry. For a split second we all stood frozen in shock. Then Tom broke the silence with a terrified shout. "Dave! Dave!" We rushed to where Dave had been standing, searching frantically through the bushes. There was no sign of him, no trail, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. "What the hell just happened?" Ken demanded, his usual stoic demeanor cracking. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know, we need to find him." "Dave! Dave!" We spread out, calling Dave's name and searching the underbrush for any sign of him. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees casting long shadows that made it hard to see. We searched for what felt like hours, but there was no trace of Dave. As the sun began to set, we regrouped, exhausted and terrified. Tom was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Even Ken looked shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them through his hair. "We need to head back to the cabin and call for help," Tom said, his voice grim. Reluctantly, we made our way back, the forest growing darker with each passing minute. Every sound, every shadow seemed menacing now. The whistle came again and again, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, as if taunting us. When we finally reached the cabin, Tom tried to get a signal on his cell phone, but there was no reception. The landline in the cabin was dead. "We need to drive to town and get help," I said, grabbing the keys to Dave's Bronco. We piled into the vehicle and sped down the narrow dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The drive to town was tense, none of us speaking. I kept expecting something to jump out in front of the car, or for Dave to suddenly appear on the roadside. When we reached the nearest town, we rushed into the sheriff's office, breathless and frantic. Sheriff Mason, a grizzled man in his late 50s, listened patiently as we told him what had happened. "All right," he said when we finished, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'll gather a search party. You boys stay put. We'll head out at first light." We spent the night in the small town, unable to sleep. The whistle haunted my dreams, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dave being dragged into the darkness. The next morning, we joined the search party, retracing our steps to the clearing where Dave had disappeared. The day passed in a blur of searching and calling out for Dave, but there was no sign of him. As the sun began to set, Sheriff Mason called off the search for the day. "We'll start again tomorrow," he said, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Days turned into a week, and still, there was no trace of Dave. The search was eventually called off, and we were left with more questions than answers. "Sometimes people just vanish in the woods," Sheriff Mason told us, his voice heavy. "And there's no explanation. I'm sorry, boys." It was a bitter pill to swallow. Tom, Ken, and I returned to our normal lives, but nothing felt normal anymore. Dave's disappearance haunted us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, something we couldn't explain. I stopped going to the woods after that. The place that had once brought me peace now filled me with fear and uncertainty. Years passed, and the memory of that trip remained with me, a dark cloud that I couldn't escape. I never told anyone else about the whistle or the strange feeling I had in the woods. It sounded too crazy, and I didn't want to be seen as the guy with the wild stories. But I never forgot, and I always wondered what really happened to Dave in those woods. Years passed, and life moved on, as it tends to do, even in the face of tragedy. I threw myself into my work, climbing the corporate ladder with a single-minded determination that left little room for socializing or outdoor activities. The memory of that fateful camping trip lingered, a shadow at the edges of my consciousness that I did my best to ignore. I lost touch with Ken shortly after we returned from the woods. Last I heard, he'd moved out west, seeking a fresh start away from the memories that haunted him. Tom and I stayed in sporadic contact, exchanging the occasional email or phone call, but our conversations were always stilted, weighed down by the unspoken horror we'd shared. Then, on a dreary Tuesday afternoon in 2010, almost 12 years after Dave's disappearance, I received a call from Tom. His voice was trembling, a mix of excitement and fear that sent a chill down my spine. "George," he said, without preamble, "I found something about the Whistler." I felt my heart skip a beat. "What are you talking about, Tom?" "I was going through my grandpa's old things," he explained, words tumbling out in a rush. "He passed away last month, and I've been helping clear out his house. I found a journal, George. He wrote about the Whistler. He said it was real, that it took people. He even mentioned something about it happening to a friend of his." I gripped the phone tighter, my palms suddenly sweaty. "What do you mean it took people?" "His friend disappeared in the same way Dave did," Tom said, his voice dropping to a whisper as if he was afraid of being overheard. "Grandpa said the Whistler was an old spirit, something ancient that haunted the forest. He didn't have much more than that, but... George, what if it's true? What if that's what took Dave?" I didn't know what to say. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it, to tell Tom he was grasping at straws. But deep down, I knew there was something more to the story. The memory of that haunting whistle, the inexplicable way Dave had vanished, it all came flooding back. "I don't know, Tom," I finally replied, my voice heavy with resignation. "Maybe it is, but what can we do about it now?" "I'm not sure," Tom admitted, "but I had to tell you. Maybe it's just closure, knowing that we're not crazy, that there might be an explanation, even if it's one that doesn't make sense." After I hung up with Tom, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring out the window at the urban sprawl of Pittsburgh. The world had moved on, but in that moment I was back in those woods, listening to that eerie whistle echoing through the trees. That night, I dreamed of the forest. In my dream, I was walking along a moonlit path, the trees looming impossibly tall on either side. Ahead of me, I could see a figure. Dave. He was walking away from me, and no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't catch up to him. Then I heard it. The whistle. It started soft, barely audible, but grew louder with each passing second. Dave stopped and turned towards the sound. I tried to call out to him, to warn him, but no sound came out of my mouth. As I watched, helpless, a darkness seemed to creep out from between the trees, enveloping Dave. And then he was gone. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The dream had felt so real, so vivid. As I lay there in the dark, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I made a decision. I needed to go back to those woods. I needed to find out the truth, once and for all. The next morning, I called in sick to work and started packing. I dug out my old hiking boots and camping gear, covered in a thick layer of dust from years of disuse. As I threw supplies into my backpack, I tried not to think too hard about what I was doing. If I stopped to consider the absurdity of it all, I knew I'd lose my nerve. I left a voicemail for Tom, telling him where I was going. Part of me hoped he'd try to talk me out of it, but another part was relieved when he didn't call back immediately. This was something I needed to do alone. The drive to Allegheny National Forest was long and quiet. I kept the radio off, my mind too full of memories and fears to concentrate on music or news. As I got closer to my destination, the landscape began to change. The urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills, then to dense forest. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I recognized landmarks from that trip over a decade ago. I arrived at the ranger station in the late afternoon. The ranger on duty, a young woman named Amy, looked at me curiously as I asked about hiking permits and trail conditions. "You planning on camping out there?" she asked, eyeing my backpack. I nodded, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just for a night or two. Thought I'd do some fishing, clear my head." Amy's expression turned serious. "Well, be careful out there. We've had a few hikers go missing over the years. Make sure you stick to the marked trails and let someone know where you're going." I felt a chill run down my spine at her words, but I forced a smile. "Will do. Thanks for the warning." As I hiked into the forest, following the trail that I hoped would lead me to the old cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. The trees seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I reached the cabin just as the sun was setting. It looked even more run-down than I remembered. The wood weathered and gray, one of the windows boarded up. For a moment, I hesitated on the threshold. Was I really going to do this? Spend the night in the very place where my nightmares had begun? But I had come too far to turn back now. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was musty and damp, years of neglect evident in the sagging furniture and peeling wallpaper. I set up my sleeping bag in the main room, not wanting to sleep in the back bedroom where I had first heard the whistle. As darkness fell, I sat on the cabin's porch, watching the forest. The night was alive with sounds, the hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But I was listening for something else, straining my ears for that haunting melody that had plagued my dreams for years. Hours passed, and nothing happened. No whistle, no strange occurrences. Just the normal sounds of a forest at night. As the moon rose high in the sky, I began to feel foolish. What had I expected? That the whistler, if it even existed, would just show up because I'd come back? Exhausted and somewhat deflated, I retreated into the cabin and crawled into my sleeping bag. Despite my disappointment, sleep came quickly, the long day of travel and hiking catching up with me. I don't know how long I slept before I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time, the whistle. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere in the forest. It was just as I remembered it, hauntingly beautiful, yet terrifying in its otherworldliness. For a long moment, I sat frozen in my sleeping bag, fear paralyzing me. But then something shifted. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a need to know, to understand. I had come here for answers, and I wasn't going to let fear stop me now. With shaking hands, I pulled on my boots and jacket. I grabbed my flashlight and, after a moment's hesitation, the hunting knife I'd brought for protection. Then, taking a deep breath, I stepped out into the night. The whistle was louder now, seeming to come from the depths of the forest. As I stood on the porch, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was hard to make out in the gloom, but it seemed to be beckoning to me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get in my car and drive as far away from this place as I could. But I knew that if I left now, I'd never know the truth. I'd spend the rest of my life wondering, haunted by unanswered questions. So, with my heart in my throat, I stepped off the porch and into the forest. The figure retreated as I approached, always staying just at the edge of my flashlight's beam. The whistle continued, guiding me deeper into the woods. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the dark forest. The trees pressed in close, their branches reaching out as if trying to grab me. More than once I stumbled over hidden roots or rocks, but I pressed on. Finally, I emerged into a small clearing. The whistle stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker. In the fading light, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, in the center of the clearing, stood Dave. He looked exactly as he had the day he disappeared, not a day older. He smiled at me, but there was something off about his expression, something not quite human. "Dave," I whispered, my voice hoarse. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but what came out was not words. It was the whistle, that haunting melody that had drawn me here. As the last of my flashlight's beam died, plunging the clearing into darkness, I finally understood. The whistler wasn't some external force, some monster that prowled the woods. It was us. It was what we became when the forest took us. In that moment of terrifying clarity, I felt something grab my arm, pulling me forward. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember is the taste of leaves in my mouth and the sound of that beautiful, terrible whistle filling my ears. The police found my car 3 days later, parked at the ranger station. They searched the forest for weeks, but found no trace of me. Eventually, I was declared missing, presumed dead. But I'm not dead. I'm here, in the forest. I've become part of it, part of the legend. And when hikers venture too deep into the woods, when the curious come seeking answers to old mysteries, they might hear a whistle, a beautiful haunting melody that draws them in, deeper and deeper, until the forest claims them too. So if you're ever in the Allegheny National Forest, and you hear a whistle on the wind, turn back, run. Don't look behind you, don't try to find the source. Because if you do, you might just become part of the forest too, another voice in the eternal chorus of the Whistler. But perhaps you're wondering how I'm telling you this story if I've become part of the forest. The truth is, I'm not entirely sure. Time works differently here, in this liminal space between the world of humans and the ancient spirits of the woods. Sometimes I feel almost like my old self again, my thoughts clear and memories intact. Other times, I'm nothing more than a whisper in the wind, a flicker of movement glimpsed between the trees. In those moments of clarity, I've tried to piece together what happened to me, to understand the nature of the Whistler and this strange existence I now inhabit. I've come to believe that the Whistler isn't a single entity, but a collective consciousness, a manifestation of the forest itself. We who have been taken don't cease to exist. We become part of something larger, something older than humanity itself. I've encountered others like me in these woods. Dave is here, and others too. Hikers, campers, even a few loggers who ventured too deep into the old growth. We don't communicate in words anymore, but in feelings, in shared memories that flow between us like sap through the trees. I've learned that the forest has been taking people for centuries. Native American tribes who once lived in these lands had legends about spirits in the woods that lured people away. European settlers told stories of strange music in the forest, and people who wandered off never to return. The Whistler has always been here, always will be. But it's not evil. Not in the way humans understand good and evil. It's simply part of nature, as neutral and implacable as a storm or a drought. It takes, yes, but it also preserves. Those of us who have been claimed by the forest live on in a way, our essence becoming part of the ancient trees, our memories stored in the very soil. I don't know if I would choose this existence if given the choice. There's a peace here, a sense of belonging that I never felt in my human life. But there's also a profound loneliness, a yearning for the world I left behind. I miss the simple pleasures of human life, a warm cup of coffee on a cold morning, the laughter of friends, the satisfaction of a job well done. Sometimes I wonder about the life I left behind. Did they mourn me when I disappeared? Did Tom ever figure out what happened to me? I hope he didn't come looking. I couldn't bear the thought of him ending up here too. As for Ken, I hope he found peace out west, far from these haunted woods. And I hope that my story, if it ever reaches the outside world, brings some closure to those who knew me. I want them to know that I'm not suffering, that in some strange way, I've found a kind of immortality here in the forest. To you, dear reader, I leave this warning and this plea. Respect the wild places of the world. They are older and more powerful than you can imagine. Enjoy their beauty. Find solace in their silence, but never forget that you are a visitor in a realm that doesn't belong to humanity. And if you ever find yourself in a forest, any forest, and you hear a whistle on the wind, a sound so beautiful it makes your heart ache, so alluring you can't help but want to follow it, remember my story. Turn back, return to the world of humans, live your life, love deeply, laugh often. For some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Some questions are better left unanswered. The forest keeps its secrets, and those of us who have become part of it will keep whistling our haunting melody, forever echoing through the ancient trees. This is George Moore, signing off from the depths of Allegheny National Forest. May you never hear our whistle, and may you always find your way back home. I've always been drawn to nature, but not in the way you might expect. Growing up in suburban Atlanta, my connection to the outdoors was mostly through National Geographic documentaries and weekend trips to local parks. I wasn't some seasoned outdoorsman or professional hiker, just a regular guy who needed an escape from the digital grind of my IT job at Benchmark Systems, where I'd spent the last 7 years troubleshooting network issues and resetting passwords. The irony wasn't lost on me that I made my living helping people navigate technology while secretly dreaming of places where cell phones couldn't reach. My apartment walls were covered with photos of national parks I'd never visited, and my browser history was full of camping blogs and wilderness survival guides. It was aspirational living at its finest. My first real hiking experience came through a meetup group called Atlanta Trailblazers. Every other weekend we'd tackle different sections of the Appalachian Trail. That's where I met Sarah and Mike, a married couple who shared my growing obsession with the outdoors. Sarah worked as an emergency room nurse and had this calm, steady presence that made even the most challenging trails seem manageable. Mike was a high school science teacher with an encyclopedic knowledge of local flora and fauna. They became my mentors, teaching me everything from how to properly pack a backpack to identifying poison ivy. Over the next few years, I graduated from day hikes to overnight camping trips. My gear collection grew piece by piece, each item carefully researched and purchased with saved-up bonus checks. The camping community became my second family. Around campfires, I heard stories of close encounters with bears, getting lost in fog-covered mountains, and finding unexpected beauty in the most remote places. But none of these stories prepared me for what I would encounter in the Cherokee National Forest. The decision to take an extended solo trip came after a particularly rough quarter at work. A ransomware attack had left us scrambling for weeks, and the stress had taken its toll. When I finally got my first RV, a modest 2005 Winnebago View I'd been saving for, it felt like a sign. October seemed like the perfect time, cool enough for comfortable hiking, but before the real cold set in. I spent weeks planning the trip, poring over topographical maps and weather forecasts. The Cherokee National Forest wasn't as well known as some other destinations, but that was part of its appeal. I found a promising spot near Lake Oki, far from the popular campgrounds. Sarah lent me her satellite phone, insisting on safety, while Mike helped me plan my hiking routes. I even took a basic firearms course and purchased a Glock 19, though the weight of it felt foreign against my hip. The preparation became almost meditative. Each item was carefully selected and packed. Freeze-dried meals, water filtration systems, first aid supplies, emergency flares. I created detailed spreadsheets tracking everything from calorie counts to battery life for my devices. Looking back, there's a bitter irony in how meticulously I planned for every conventional emergency, while remaining completely blind to the true danger that awaited me. My last night in the city, I had dinner with Sarah and Mike. We spread my maps across their dining room table one final time, marking potential fishing spots and areas of interest. Sarah made me promise to check in daily with the satellite phone. "The forest has its own rules," she said, her usual composure tinged with concern. "Remember, if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't." I nodded, but didn't really understand. How could I? I was still thinking in terms of bears and bad weather, of twisted ankles and poison oak. I had no way of knowing that in just a few days I would discover exactly what Sarah meant, that some parts of the wilderness operate under laws far older and stranger than anything in our modern guidebooks. The morning I left Atlanta, the city was just beginning to stir. Traffic was light, and I watched the skyline recede in my rearview mirror as classic rock played softly on the radio. The RV handled well, and with each mile marker, I felt the weight of civilization lifting from my shoulders. I was heading towards something I'd dreamed about for years, true solitude in the wilderness. If only I'd known then what waited for me in those ancient woods. If only I'd recognized that sometimes solitude comes with a price. But as I turned onto the Forest Service road, my biggest concern was finding the perfect spot to park my RV. I was about to learn that in some places humans aren't meant to stay, and that some legends don't remain confined to campfire stories. The sun was setting as I finally found my camping spot, casting long shadows through the trees. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how peaceful. That first evening, as I set up camp and got the fire going, everything felt right. I was living my dream, wasn't I? But sometimes dreams turn to nightmares. And in the Cherokee National Forest, I was about to discover exactly how thin the line between them can be. The first 2 days passed peacefully enough. I settled into a routine. Wake at dawn, cook breakfast over the campfire, then explore the surrounding trails. The weather held beautiful, crisp October days with just enough chill to make hiking comfortable. I caught a few bass in the lake, photographed some interesting fungi that Mike would have loved to identify, and generally felt at peace. Looking back, there were signs I should have noticed sooner. On the second afternoon, I found a deer carcass that didn't make sense. It wasn't torn apart like a normal predator kill. Instead, it was arranged almost ceremonially, its limbs positioned at unnatural angles. I took photos to show Mike later, telling myself it was probably just a mountain lion or bear that had left its meal unfinished. That night, I first heard the thumping. It began just after sunset, a deep rhythmic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The closest comparison I can make is a massive heartbeat, but even that doesn't quite capture it. The sound had weight to it, like each beat was pressing against my ears. I tried radioing Sarah on the satellite phone, but got only static. The temperature had dropped dramatically, my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. The thumping continued for exactly 17 minutes. I know because I counted every beat before stopping as suddenly as it began. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the RV, every whisper of wind through the trees set my nerves on edge. I kept the Glock close, though my rational mind told me I was overreacting. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded like singing, a low melodic chant in a language I didn't recognize. I told myself it was just the wind. Dawn brought no relief. The morning air felt thick, almost gelatinous, and an odd smell hung about the campsite, something ancient and musty, like opening a tomb. That's when I noticed the tracks. They circled the RV in a perfect spiral, starting from about 20 feet out and moving inward. Each print was nearly 2 feet long, with what looked like 6 toes splayed out like a fan. The inner tracks were pressed deeper into the earth, as if whatever made them was getting heavier as it moved closer. I spent the morning photographing the prints and trying to convince myself they had a rational explanation, but deep down I knew I was witnessing something beyond the realm of normal wildlife. The locals had warned me about Gorm. I'd dismissed their stories as campfire tales meant to spook tourists. Now, those warnings echoed in my mind with terrible clarity. That afternoon, I hiked deeper into the forest, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The trees seemed to grow denser, their branches interweaving overhead until barely any sunlight penetrated. The air grew colder with each step, despite it being mid-afternoon. I found the first artifact about 2 miles in, a crude statue carved from a single piece of dark wood. It depicted a humanoid figure with elongated limbs and a head that seemed to be mostly mouth. The craftsmanship was incredible, each detail perfectly rendered, yet it looked ancient. I knew I should leave it alone, but I took pictures, my hands shaking as I tried to steady the camera. The scream came just as I was turning to head back. It sounded human, but distorted somehow like someone crying out underwater. It came from deeper in the forest, where the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Every instinct told me to run back to the RV, but I couldn't leave someone who might need help. I followed the sound, my phone's GPS tracking my location so I could find my way back. The screams grew more frequent, more desperate. The forest floor was littered with more statues now, some broken, some intact, all depicting the same elongated figure. The air grew thick with that musty smell, and the temperature continued to drop. Then I found the clearing. It was a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across, completely devoid of vegetation. In the center stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered. The surface was stained dark, and I didn't want to think about what might have caused those stains. Arranged around the altar in concentric circles were hundreds of the wooden statues, all facing inward. That's when I heard it. The same rhythmic thumping from the night before, but louder now, much louder. The ground seemed to pulse with each beat. The shadows between the trees began to move to coalesce into something solid. Gorm emerged from the darkness like a tear in reality. The stories hadn't done it justice. It stood at least 12 feet tall, its body a mass of elongated limbs and angular joints that moved in ways that violated every law of anatomy. Its skin was a mottled gray, seeming to shift and ripple like smoke. But its face, God, its face. A massive jaw filled with row upon row of teeth and eyes, so many eyes, all of them focusing on me at once. I fired the Glock without conscious thought, emptying the entire magazine. The bullet seemed to pass through Gorm like it was made of mist, but the impacts made it screech, a sound that felt like ice picks in my brain. It lunged for me with impossible speed, those long limbs reaching, grasping. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs. Behind me, I could hear it moving through the forest, its footfalls matching that terrible rhythmic thumping. Trees cracked and splintered as it pursued me. I don't remember most of the run back to the RV. Blind panic has a way of erasing details. I do remember the cold, an unnatural cold that seemed to reach into my very soul. And I remember the singing, that terrible melodic chanting that seemed to come from the forest itself. When I reached the RV, I didn't stop to gather anything. I jumped in, turned the key, and drove. The engine struggled at first. The cold shouldn't have affected it that much, but finally roared to life. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of Gorm emerging from the tree line, its form seeming to bend and distort as it moved. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached Atlanta. Sarah and Mike didn't believe me at first, but the photos convinced them something had happened. The pictures of the tracks and the statues came out clear enough, but every photo I took of the altar was corrupted, just a solid black frame. The police were less helpful. They suggested bears, mountain lions, even homeless people playing pranks, but they couldn't explain the tracks, and when I offered to lead them back to the site, they always had excuses not to go. That was 15 years ago. I've never gone camping again, never even been hiking. I sold the RV and moved to Chicago, as far from the Cherokee National Forest as I could manage, but distance hasn't helped. The nightmares still come, filled with that rhythmic thumping and the sound of ancient singing. Sometimes on cold nights when I can't sleep, I look up news reports from the area. Every few years, someone else goes missing in those woods. The official reports blame animal attacks or hiking accidents, but I know better. I know what's out there, waiting in the ancient dark of the forest. I've tried to warn people, posting my story on forums, reaching out to other witnesses. Most think I'm crazy or looking for attention, but occasionally someone reaches out with their own story, their own encounter with something they can't explain. The details vary, but certain elements remain constant. The thumping, the cold, the singing in an unknown language. Last week I received a package. No return address, just my name and address printed in precise block letters. Inside was one of those wooden statues, exactly like the ones I saw in the forest. The craftsmanship was just as perfect, just as ancient. But this one was different. The figure was looking over its shoulder, and its face was mine. I'm writing this now because people need to know the truth. Something ancient dwells in the Cherokee National Forest. Something that was old when the first humans set foot in those woods. It's patient, it's powerful, and it's waiting. If you value your life, your sanity, stay on the marked trails. Better yet, stay away entirely. Because Gorm is real, and sometimes, when the night is especially quiet, I swear I can hear that rhythmic thumping, growing closer with each beat.